Meanwhile, in the house by the sea, Dracon thought for a while and decided to go back to the Dragon Palace to have a look. Digging out his car key, he walked toward the door. "Louise, I'm sorry to be leaving so suddenly, but I have to deal with some urgent business matters. I will come back later."
"It's okay. Get on with your business first,"
Jacob's grandma said with understanding. Dracon walked out of the house and passed the door, driving away shortly. Helen was worried about Dracon, but she remained calm and continued to chat with Louise. Jacob knew something was wrong, but since Dracon was already dealing with it, he settled down and kept his grandma company. After about 10 minutes, Dracon returned.
"What's wrong?"
Seeing he returned so soon, Grandma asked. "Nothing. The problem is solved." Dracon looked relaxed and cheerful, entirely different from the look he had when he left just minutes ago. Even Sophie had never seen her usually stern father so cheerful. Helen was curious, so she bumped Dracon lightly.
"What happened?"
When Liam called Dracon, she had heard the conversation. It didn't sound like good news, since Grandmaster Hank broke into the North Atlantic Dragon Palace and rescued the South Atlantic Elders. It was just a business issue. It's all solved." Dracon's tone was upbeat, and his face was flushed with excitement. He looked different.
"It is good to hear that your problem is solved."
Grandma didn't probe. Seeing the cheerful expression on his face, she was relieved. However, Helen was not satisfied. Pinching his arm lightly, she asked in a low voice,
"What happened?"
Jacob was also curious, and he listened attentively to their conversation. Dracon looked back at Helen before glancing at Jacob and answered in a whisper, "South Atlantic just sent a peace treaty through their general. They will trade the life of Henry with 25,000 pounds of gold, 50,000 pounds of silver, 300 10,000-year-old deep ocean corals, 800 top-tier nightly pearls, 500 foundation building pills, and 12 South Atlantic mystic ice. Besides, they offered a peace period of 500 years between the two clans."
"Really?"
Helen had been calm in every emergency, but this time she was astonished. "I don't know if it's a trick of theirs. Tomorrow evening, the general from South Atlantic will come to our palace with the gifts and pick up Henry," Dracon said.
"But South Atlantic's style is not to play tricks. They don't think they need schemes with their greater strength,"
Helen analyzed in a low voice. Standing next to them, Jacob too didn't understand the 180-degree change in South Atlantic's attitude.
"Mom, I've taken out all the veggies. Should I get started on washing them?"
Standing on the other side of the living room, Sophie asked with a couple of potatoes in her hands. Helen glanced at Dracon.
"We'll talk about it when we get home."
She turned to face Sophie.
"You can get the prep started."
Sophie didn't know how to cook at all, but she wanted to look more mature in front of Jacob's grandma, so she decided to help with the dinner as much as she could today.
"Jade, Julia, come with me. We should get started on the dinner."
Helen beckoned to the sisters. She was the only one out of the lot who actually knew how to cook.
"Okay,"
the sisters answered in unison. Obediently, Jade and Julia followed Helen to the kitchen and helped her. Jacob felt bad that other people had to cook in his house, so he went in there as well to help out. By the time the bunch reached inside the kitchen, Sophie had already washed all the veggies and had nothing to do now, so she stopped for a while and stood beside Jacob. "What are you doing here?" Jacob turned his head slightly and looked at her.
"Nothing,"
Sophie smiled. Jacob rinsed the pots that they needed to cook. He was working silently while Sophie just observed him. Sophie suddenly said,
"We should call Kathy."
"What? Are you trying to mess with me?" Jacob looked at her in surprise.
"Not at all. She's your friend, right?"
Sophie glanced at him. Ignoring her sudden interest in Kathy, Jacob scrubbed the pot in his hand more thoroughly.
"Give me your cell phone. I'll call her."
Sophie reached out her hand. "Listen, it's late. She must have slept." Jacob tried to reason. However, Sophie didn't give up. While he was busy scrubbing, she stuck her hand into his pocket for his cell phone. Jacob tried to dodge, but her hand kept wriggling in his pocket. Jacob panicked. Finally, she grabbed the cell phone and took it out of his pocket. "Hey, give it back!" Jacob chased her with the pot in his hand. However, she had run out of the kitchen and then out of the house, making the call. With the pot in his hand, standing at the kitchen door, Jacob could only watch her. Helen and the twins saw this exchange and didn't think much of it, as they hadn't paid attention to what the two had been talking about. Minutes later, Sophie returned to the kitchen with his cell phone. "Did you finish the call?" Jacob looked at her.
"No, I lied to you. I didn't call her."
Sophie slipped the cell phone back into his pocket before running inside the kitchen to join Helen and the sisters. Jacob didn't believe her. After drying his hands, he took out the cell phone and pulled out the recent calls. Sure enough, there was a call made to Kathy a few minutes ago. He dialed her number, and it was answered after 2 rings. "Kathy?" Jacob said immediately.
"Yeah, it's me."
Kathy answered. "Did Sophie call you?" Jacob asked.
"Yeah, she called me."
She answered lightly. "What did she say?" Jacob asked cautiously.
"Nothing important. She just invited me over for dinner."
She paused for a few seconds before asking,
"Is she with you right now?"
"Yeah, she's at my home with her parents."
"Oh."
Silence. To break the silence, Jacob asked her, "What are you doing?"
"Reading."
"Are you home alone?"
"Yeah."
She answered in a low voice. Do you want to come over and have dinner with us? Jade and Julia are here as well."
"No, I'll cook something for myself."
"Oh." Now Jacob didn't know what to say.
"Have fun. I'll go back to my book."
Kathy's words signaled her intention to end the conversation. "Okay, and Grandma hopes that you can come over when you have time," he said.
"Got it,"
she answered before hanging up. Jacob was suddenly at a loss. He could imagine Kathy sitting in the small, windowless room, reading under a yellow lamp. Seeing Sophie helping Helen inside, Jacob wondered if Sophie had invited Kathy just to mess with him, or did she actually want her to come? "Jacob, are you done washing the pots?" Grandma called him from the living room. "Yeah, it's done," he answered immediately before taking the pot back to the kitchen. Then a boisterous and lively feast began. With Grandma in the center, everyone talked, laughed, and got closer to each other in the process. Dracon was in a great mood, eating, drinking, and talking a lot. Grandma rarely had so many people eating a meal with her in recent years, so she was delighted. When the night came, Jacob and the sisters cleaned the table, and then it was almost time to leave. Grandma stood in the doorway, seeing them off reluctantly. There were 2 vacant spots in the car, so Dracon would drive Jade and Julia back to Liam's place. Since Jade and Julia were Liam's so-called granddaughters, they were also part of Dracon's big family in a way. While their car drove away slowly, Grandma sighed slightly. Loneliness always came after a party. Knowing Grandma's sentiments, Jacob helped her back to the house. "I called Kathy today, but she said she is busy and can't come," Grandma said while walking into the house. "Yeah, I guess she's busy," Jacob said helplessly. "Well, it's okay. Nothing is perfect in the world." With a wave of her hand, Grandma walked into the brightly lit house slowly. While Jacob sighed together with his grandma, in her small room, Kathy rubbed her head and closed a thick book. After checking the clock on the desk, she rolled her shoulders and stood up.
Well, it's time for me to go to the grandma's place and cultivate.